So the reason we're talking about Planaria is not only are they immortal, okay, not only do they regenerate every part of the body, they generally don't get cancer, right? So, which we can talk about why that's important. They're smart. They can learn things, so you can train them. And it turns out that if you train a planarian and then cut their heads off, the tail will regenerate a brand new brain that still remembers the original information. So here's your planaria. You cut off the head, you cut off the tail, you have a middle fragment. That middle fragment has to make one head and one tail. How does it know how many of each to make, and where do they go? How come it doesn't switch? How come, right? So we did a very simple thing, and we said, okay, let's make the hypothesis that there's a somatic electrical network that remembers the correct pattern, and that what it's doing is recalling that memory and building to that pattern. So what we did was we used a way to visualize electrical activity in these cells, right? It's a variant of what people use to look for electricity in the brain, and we saw that it has that fragment has a very particular electrical pattern. You can literally see it once we developed the technique. It has a very particular electrical pattern that shows you where the head and the tail goes. Right? You can just see it. And then we said, okay, well, now let's test the idea that that's a memory that actually controls where the head and the tail goes. Let's change that pattern. So basically incept a false memory. And so what you can do is you can do that in many different ways. One way is with drugs that target ion channels to say, and so you pick these drugs and you say, okay, I'm going to do it so that instead of this one head, one tail electrical pattern, you have a two-headed pattern, right? You're just editing the electrical information in the network. When you do that, guess what the cells build? They build a two-headed worm. And the coolest thing about it, now no genetic changes, so we haven't touched the genome. The genome is totally wild type. But the amazing thing about it is that when you take these two-headed animals and you cut them into pieces again, some of those pieces will continue to make two-headed animals. So that information, that memory, that electrical circuit, not only does it hold the information for how many heads, not only does it use that information to tell the cells what to do to regenerate, but it stores it. Once you've reset it, it keeps. And we can go back. We can take a two-headed animal and put it back to one-headed. So now imagine, so there's a couple of interesting things here that have implications for understanding of genomes and things like that. Imagine I take this two-headed animal, oh, and by the way, when they reproduce, when they tear themselves in half, you still get two-headed animals. So imagine I take them and I throw them in the Charles River over here. So 100 years later, some scientists come along and they scoop up some samples and they go, oh, here's a single-headed form and a two-headed form. Wow, a speciation event. Cool. Let's sequence the genome and see what happened. The genomes are identical. There's nothing wrong with the genome. So if you ask the question, so this goes back to your very first question, is where do body plans come from, right? How does the planarian know how many heads it's supposed to have? Now, it's interesting because you could say DNA, but what as it turns out, the DNA produces a piece of hardware that by default says one head. The way that when you turn on a calculator, by default, it says 0 every single time, right? When you turn it on, it just says 0. But it's a programmable calculator, as it turns out. So once you've changed that, next time it won't say 0. It'll say something else. And the same thing here. So you can make one-headed, two-headed. You can make no-headed worms. We've done some other things along these lines, some other really weird constructs. So this question of, right, so again, it's really important. The hardware software distinction is really important because the hardware is essential, because without proper hardware, you're never going to get to the right physiology of having that memory. But once you have it, it doesn't fully determine what the information is going to be. You can have other information in there, and it's reprogrammable by us, by bacteria, by various parasites, probably, things like that. The other amazing thing about these planarias, think about this. Most animals, when we get a mutation in our bodies, our children don't inherit it, right? So you could run around for 50, 60 years getting mutations. Your children don't have those mutations because we go through the egg stage. Planaria tear themselves in half, and that's how they reproduce. So for 400 million years, they keep every mutation that they've had that doesn't kill the cell that it's in. So when you look at these planaria, their bodies are what's called mixoploid, meaning that every cell might have a different number of chromosomes. They look like a tumor. If you look at the genome is an incredible mess because they accumulate all this stuff. And yet their body structure they are the best regenerators on the planet. Their anatomy is rock solid, even though their genome is all kinds of crap. So this is kind of a scandal, right? That, when we learn that, what are genomes? Well, genomes determine your body. Okay, why does the animal with the worst genome have the best anatomical control, the most cancer resistant, the most regenerative, right? Really, we're just beginning to start to understand this relationship between the genomically determined hardware and by the way, just as of a couple of months ago, I think I now somewhat understand why this is, but it's really a major puzzle.